Hey, it's your guy Tyrrell back with the interviews. In today's video, we're going to analyze the tactics that Pep Guardiola utilized to help Manchester City destroy Burnley. So when we break down the game and we do look at the board, we have Manchester City in a 4-3-3 against Burnley's 4-4-2. And this game was about how City were able to break down that Burnley backline that ended up dropping off into two deep banks of four, with the wider players tucking in narrow to help Burnley compress space in midfield and limit City's ability to expose space between the lines. And then they had Vidra and Rodriguez in between Rodri to ensure that he couldn't dictate the tempo from deeper positions. So when we analyze this game, we have to look at the roles that City's players were adopting. And we'll start with Sergio Aguero, who was occupied by me and Tarkowski, and he was often dropping off ahead of them to try and receive the ball. And at times he was even dropping off a bit deeper in between Cork and Westwood to check in for service. What we can say is that there was balance out in those wider flanks, and although it was contrasting when you compare the left to the right, what we should say first is that City didn't look to have their fullbacks overlapping or underlapping on a consistent basis, so we ended up seeing Cancelo and Zinchenko adopt deeper roles. When we look to the left-hand side, you have Phil Foden shifting into narrow positions in that gap just ahead of Loughton and Tarkowski. When Foden shifted into those zones, you would have Zinchenko towards the touchline, and then you would have David Silva in between Brownhill and Westwood. Although City didn't offer any natural width down that left-hand side, we did see varied movement that helped City bypass that Burnley defense. There were times where you did have Foden shifting out to that left touchline, and what he wanted to do was that he was able to pull out Brownhill, and that would allow him to drop off the ball to Zinchenko ahead of Westwood in that central midfield zone. But because Burnley's shape was so narrow, there was always a passing lane out into those wider areas. But the key to their success down that left-hand side was the positioning of David Silva and Foden. What you ended up seeing was that Silva was in between Westwood and Cork, but whenever City looked to get the ball out into those wider areas to Zinchenko or Foden, Silva would push into that gap beyond Westwood and Brownhill, and that's when he would look to receive the ball between the lines or look to push into that space between Loughton and Tarkowski. What we ended up seeing was that David Silva and Bernardo Silva were often boxed into that gap out in those narrow, wider areas. So they would be ahead of the center back and the fullback, but just in behind the Burnley wide player and the central midfielder. But what we often ended up seeing down that left-hand side was that when City were looking to advance the ball into Burnley's third, Silva would push into the gap just in beside Foden, and that's how they would look to combine in that area. But as stated earlier, City created their best chances down that left-hand side through the positioning and movement of Foden and Silva. It took them around 16 minutes to create their first legitimate chance, and what we ended up seeing was that you had Fernandinho sliding the ball across Brownhill into the path of Zinchenko. When Zinchenko receives that ball, you end up seeing Foden in between Loughton and Tarkowski, and that's when you end up seeing Silva break into that space beyond Brownhill and Westwood. When Zinchenko receives that ball, he ends up sliding it across Brownhill and Westwood for David Silva, and when David Silva receives that ball, he ends up witnessing Aguero ahead of me. You have Bernardo Silva breaking between Cork and McNeil, and then you have Mahrez free in that right channel. The reason why Mahrez is free is because Aguero begins to dart in between me and Taylor, and that creates a gap for Silva to slide the ball across Taylor, for Bernardo Silva breaking into the box, but his first touch forces him onto his right foot and he ends up slashing it wide of the net. Approximately 10 minutes later, we witnessed City get into another promising goal-scoring position by looking to play through that left-hand side. It starts with Fernandinho once again on the ball, and Rodriguez looks to step towards him, and before Fernandinho slides that ball across Rodriguez and Brownhill into the path of Zinchenko, look at the positioning of the City attacking players. You have Bernardo Silva and David Silva once again between the lines, behind the Burnley wide and central midfielders, but the difference here is that you end up seeing David Silva in that gap just ahead of Loughton and Tarkowski, but you also have Foden occupying that space. So that's where you end up seeing how City were able to maximize that positioning. Aguero was in between the center backs. So what you end up seeing is that when Fernandinho slides the ball out to Zinchenko once again has that gap to slide the ball across Brownhill and Westwood for Silva, and no one can step towards him because of the movement of Foden and the movement of Aguero. So what you end up seeing here is that Silva tries to play in Aguero, who's running across me, but the pass is slightly behind him, and City is unable to force Pope into a save from that great positioning from David Silva. And when we look to the build-up to the penalty that helps City kill off the game with their third goal, once again, stems through the movement of Foden and David Silva. It also starts with Fernandinho in Burnley's half, and what we see from City's positioning here is that you have David Silva and Phil Foden in the same position, just ahead of Lowton and Tarkowski. You have Aguero ahead of the center backs. You end up seeing Bernardo Silva shifting to the right of Taylor, and then you have Mahrez shifting laterally across me into a central position. So when Fernandinho looks to push forward, he splits Westwood and Cork, looking for Aguero dropping off into that gap, but Aguero leaves it for Mahrez. So when Mahrez receives that ball ahead of me, he instantly splits Westwood and Tarkowski with a squared pass into the path of David Silva, and when Silva turns away from them, he's able to play a reverse ball in between Brownhill and Lowton for Phil Foden breaking into left half space. What you see from Foden here is that he ends up pulling the ball back in between Tarkowski and Lowton for Sergio Aguero, and that's when you end up seeing Ben Mee go across Aguero to concede the penalty that Mahrez eventually converted. However, City offered a different threat down that right-hand side due to the positioning of Mahrez, who was looking to hug the touchline. So what you often ended up seeing was that if Cancelo would wrap the ball around McNeil, then you would have Mahrez receiving the ball ahead of Taylor, and that's when you would expect Bernardo Silva to dart into space behind Taylor. But what we often ended up seeing was that when Mahrez would receive that ball or hold the touchline, then you would have Bernardo Silva also in that gap in behind Cork and McNeil and just ahead of me and Taylor. Cancelo, like I said, was holding a narrow position. So what ended up happening was that whenever Mahrez received that ball on that right touchline, McNeil was looking to drop off deeper to put Mahrez in a 1v2 situation and help Taylor from getting isolated in that wide zone. And similar to the left-hand side, we would see the varied movement. If Mahrez would drop just ahead of McNeil and Cork, then you would have Bernardo Silva shifting towards the touchline. Throughout that game, we ended up seeing Bernardo Silva and David Silva shift out into wider positions just outside of McNeil and Brownhill to get on the ball, and specifically down City's right-hand side. As that game continued, you would have Mahrez and Bernardo Silva dropping off ahead of McNeil to the left of Vidra to pick up possession and try and build attacks from that zone. An example of the threat that Bernardo Silva and Mahrez's movement caused down that right-hand side was witnessed in the build-up to the corner kick that led to City's opening goal. What you end up seeing is that Otamendi is on the ball and he slides it across McNeil into the path of Mahrez on that right touchline. Taylor instantly steps into the path of Mahrez, but when Mahrez receives that ball, you end up locating Bernardo Silva to the right of McNeil in that gap between McNeil and Cork. So when Mahrez receives the ball and pulls out Taylor, you see Bernardo Silva looking to make that darting run behind Taylor, but Westwood does a very good job of tracking that movement to halt Bernardo Silva from getting into that zone. What you end up seeing now is that rather than playing the ball around Taylor, Mahrez ends up splitting McNeil and Taylor to find Bernardo Silva, who turns to face Westwood, and that's when you see Mahrez run into that space between McNeil and Taylor to receive the ball back from Bernardo Silva. When Mahrez receives that ball beyond Westwood, you locate the run of Sergio Aguero in beyond me. You end up seeing David Silva dart between Lowton and Tarkowski towards the box, and that frees up space for Phil Foden to break freely into left half space. Mahrez should slide the ball out to Foden, but he ends up playing the reverse pass across Westwood and me to try and meet with Aguero, and that ends up seeing me concede the corner kick that City eventually convert from. Around the 12th minute mark, we ended up witnessing the ideal shape that Guardiola wanted to implement to be able to maximize Mahrez's space and talent down that right-hand side. What we ended up seeing was that we had Otamendi on the ball ahead of the Burnley central forwards. You had Cancelo in a narrow position ahead of McNeil, and what you ended up seeing in those wider areas was that you had Mahrez free in that right touchline position, and he was free based off the fact that you had Bernardo Silva in between me and Taylor, and you ended up having David Silva in between Loughton and Tarkowski. Aguero was occupying the center backs, and Phil Foden was looking to break off the shoulder of Loughton. So like I said, when City looked to push forward, you would see Bernardo Silva and David Silva push beyond those gaps that they initially occupied to place themselves in between the center backs and the full backs, and that would force Burnley to adopt a narrow position defensively, and that would create space out in those wider areas for City to shift diagonal balls into that zone. Mahrez did expose that Burnley backline throughout that game, and when you look to the build-up to the second goal, it similarly epitomizes it. You have Fernandinho clipping that diagonal ball out into that right channel, and then you have Mahrez in that 1v1 with Taylor, with me shifting across, and as Mahrez looks to cut central, he simply back cuts into right half space and he beats Nick Pope. But as you can see, along with Burnley's inability to defend Manchester City's short corner kicks, it was Manchester City's balanced wide play that decided this game. When you look to the right-hand side, the combination between Bernardo Silva and Riyad Mahrez with their positioning caused that Burnley backline problems, along with Mahrez breaking in behind. And when you look to the left, the positioning of David Silva and Phil Foden was the reason why City were able to create their best chances in that game, and those key elements were the reason why City claimed all 3 points. Hi everybody, thanks for watching, and subscribe here for your latest tactical analysis and daily commentary on the InnerViews show. And if that wasn't enough, don't forget you could find more organic, unfiltered soccer/football analysis on the InnerViews podcast, the best soccer/football podcast in the world, available on iTunes, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Spreaker, and any Android apps on your Android devices.